Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really big one, the Federal Reserve System.
Yeah, the Fed. Hugely important for the U.S. economy.
Absolutely. You've shared some Wikipedia excerpts, and the mission today is basically to pull out the key stuff.
Right. What it is, why it matters, the core ideas.
Exactly. Without getting totally bogged down, consider this your sort of essential guide based on these sources.
Sounds good. We'll look at its origins, its setup, its main jobs,
Yeah.
the fundamentals.
Perfect. So let's just dive right in. The big question first. What is the Federal Reserve, and why do we even have it?
Okay, so according to the info, it was officially created December 23rd, 1913.
Wow, okay, over a century ago.
Yeah. And the main driver, it was a whole series of financial panics. Things were pretty unstable.
Banks, like bank runs.
Exactly. The panic of 1907 seems to have been a really big trigger.
Ah,
It
right.
just highlighted that the U.S. banking system back then, it couldn't really handle major shocks or wasn't a central place to get emergency funds.
So the idea was we need some central control to stop these crises from just wrecking everything.
Precisely. To provide liquidity, act as a backstop. But its job description definitely grew over time.
How so?
Well, major events like the Great Depression and much later the Great Recession in 2008, they forced the Fed to take on, well, broader roles and responsibilities.
Okay, so it started with preventing panics, but it's become more than just a financial firefighter.
Much more.
So what are its main purposes today, according to the sources? The Federal Reserve Act mentioned things like furnishing an elastic currency.
Yeah, basically making the money supply more flexible and also rediscounting commercial paper that's like a way for banks to borrow short term. Better bank supervision, too.
Seems like a solid foundation.
It was. And today, well, it still deals with panics, obviously. It's the central bank. But it also tries to balance private bank interests with government oversight.
Okay.
Supervises banks, protects consumer credit rights, conducts monetary policy.
Ah, monetary policy. That's the big one, right? The dual mandate.
That's the one. Maximum employment and stable prices.
And stable prices means like 2% inflation.
That's generally the target they aim for, yes.
Yeah.
Plus moderate long-term interest rates.
Sounds complicated. Hitting all those targets at once.
It definitely is a balancing act. And, going back to the bank panics, to really get why the Fed's role there is so critical, you need to understand fractional reserve banking.
Right. Banks only keep a fraction of deposits on hand.
Exactly. They lend the rest out.
Mm-hmm.
It works well for economic growth, usually.
Right.
But if everyone suddenly wants their money back.
That's a bank run. System collapse potential.
Precisely. And that's where the Fed steps in as the lender of last resort. It provides emergency cash to solvent banks facing these runs.
Like a safety net for the whole system.
Mm-hmm. The economist Milton Friedman, he actually argued the Fed didn't act decisively enough during the Depression's bank runs, making things much worse.
Interesting. So inaction can be as damaging as the wrong action.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The sources also mentioned the Fed's role in the payment system, like check clearing.
Oh, yeah. To stop what happened in 1907, where banks got scared to accept checks from each other.
Exactly.
Huh.
Smooth payments are crucial for just, well, everyday business.
And that lender of last resort thing isn't just history, right? Didn't they lend a huge amount to AIG in 2008?
They did. $85 billion. A massive intervention to prevent, a wider meltdown.
Wow. Okay. And it's also the government's bank.
And the banker's bank. Yeah, it handles the Treasury's main account, sells government bonds.
Manages payments between banks safely.
Right. And it issues the currency, the Federal Reserve notes. Though, fun fact, the Treasury actually does the printing.
Huh. I saw a figure in the source. Something like 58 billion notes issued in FY 2020.
Yeah, at a cost of about 7.4 cents each. It's a massive physical operation alongside everything else.
So when they talk monetary policy, what are federal funds?
Ah, good question. Those are the reserves banks keep at the Fed. They lend these reserves to each other overnight.
Okay.
And the interest rate on those loans, that's the federal funds rate. That's the main rate the Fed targets to influence the whole economy.
Got it. Okay, so that covers the what and why. What about the structure? How is this thing actually put together? It sounds kind of complex.
It is. It's described as multi-layered. You've got the Board of Governors at the top in D.C.
Right, the main governing body.
7 members, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate.
And they serve really long terms, right? 14 years.
Yeah, staggered 14-year terms.
Yeah.
The idea is to give them independence from, short-term political wins.
Makes sense. And the sources list the current members as of April 2025. Powell as chair, Jefferson as vice chair, Bowman, Waller, Cook, Barr, Kugler.
Correct. The chair and vice chair have shorter 4-year terms, but they can be reappointed.
And getting confirmed isn't always easy, apparently. Obama had some nominees face pushback.
True. Then under the board, you have the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC.
That's the really important one for monetary policy.
That's the key policy setting group. It has 12 voting members.
The 7 governors,
Huh?
plus who else?
Plus 5 of the 12 regional Federal Reserve Bank presidents.
Ah, the regional banks. Okay.
And those 5 spots rotate, except for the president of the New York Fed. They're always on the FOMC.
Why New York?
Because the New York Fed is right there in the heart of the financial markets and actually implements the open market operations.
Okay. So the FOMC decides on interest rate targets and stuff.
Exactly. Through things like open market operations.
And then there are the 12 regional banks themselves.
Yeah.
Spread across the country.
Yep. In major cities, Boston, New York, Philly, Cleveland, Chicago, Atlanta, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Dallas, San Francisco. Did I miss one? Richmond.
Huh. Okay. And they oversee the regular banks in their area.
They do supervise and regulate them. And here's where it gets interesting again, that public-private mix.
How so?
The regional banks are sort of quasi-private.
Hmm.
Member banks, commercial banks in their district actually own stock in their regional Fed.
Wait, private banks own stock in the Fed?
Yeah. If a bank is nationally chartered, it has to be a member and buy stock. State-chartered banks can choose.
Does that mean the banks control the Fed?
Not really, according to the sources. It's more symbolic. They get a dividend, usually capped at 6%, and they elect some of the regional bank directors, but they don't dictate monetary policy. One source mentioned about 38% of U.S. banks are members.
Okay, so it's ownership, but not control in the usual sense.
Right. And those regional bank boards have different classes of directors. Class A representing banks, Class B and C representing the public, things like commerce, agriculture, labor, again, trying to balance interests.
It's a unique structure. What about accountability? Who watches the watchers?
Good question. Their books are audited externally. The GAO Government Accountability Office can audit them too. But there are some restrictions.
Yeah, restrictions.
Yes, specifically around monetary policy decisions and discussions and dealings with foreign entities. The idea is protect policy independence.
But there have been pushes for more transparency, right? Like that Bloomberg lawsuit after 2008.
Exactly. Bloomberg sued under the Freedom of Information Act to find out who got emergency loans during the crisis, and they eventually won access to a lot of that data. So there is external scrutiny.
Okay, let's switch gears to monetary policy tools. We know the goals, employment, stable prices. How do they actually do it? How do they influence interest rates?
They have a toolkit, and it's evolved, especially after 2008.
Right. The main tool now, the source says, is interest on reserve balances, IORB.
Correct. That's the interest the Fed pays banks on the reserves they hold at the Fed.
How does paying banks interest help steer the main rate?
Well, think about it. If a bank can earn, say, 5% risk-free just parking money at the Fed, why would it lend that money overnight to another bank for less than 5%?
Ah, okay. So IORB sets a kind of floor under the federal funds rate?
Exactly. Then there's a supplementary tool called the Overnight Reverse Repurchase Agreement Facility, or ON-RRP.
That sounds technical.
It kind of is. But basically, the Fed offers to borrow money overnight from certain non-bank institutions, like money market funds, paying them interest. This helps put a sort of ceiling under the federal funds rate, keeping it within the Fed's target range.
Okay, so IORB and ON-RRP work together to bracket the target rate. What else? Open market operations.
Still crucial. That's the buying and selling of government securities, mostly treasury bonds.
But the goal isn't quite the same as before 2008.
Right. Before 2008, they used it to fine-tune the supply of reserves to hit the rate target. Now the system operates with ample reserves.
Ample reserves, meaning there's plenty of liquidity already.
Yeah. So open market operations are now mainly used to just maintain that ample level, ensuring the system runs smoothly, while IORB and ON-RRP do the main work of steering the rate.
Got it. And the last main tool mentioned is the discount window.
Yes. That's direct lending from the Fed to banks. The interest rate on that, the discount rate, is usually set a bit above the main target rate.
Why higher?
To encourage banks to borrow from each other first, and only use the Fed's window as a backup, a safety valve.
Okay, makes sense. Lender of last resort function again?
Precisely. The sources also briefly mentioned repos repurchase agreements, another form of short-term lending, and a term deposit facility to help manage reserves, but those 4 are the main ones now.
And then there's QE, quantitative easing. We heard about that a lot after 2008.
Right. That's different. QE involves the Fed buying longer-term assets like treasury bonds or even mortgage-backed securities.
Not just managing overnight rates.
No, the goal here is to push down longer-term interest rates directly and inject significant liquidity into the financial system, especially when short-term rates are already near zero.
Like during the financial crisis and its aftermath.
Exactly. And it's worth noting some tools aren't really used anymore. Reserve requirements dictating how much cash banks had to hold were a big tool historically,
But now?
set to zero in March 2020. And many temporary facilities created during the 2008 crisis, like the term auction facility, have expired.
Okay, so the toolkit evolves. Let's jump back in time a bit. The Fed wasn't the first attempt at central banking in the U.S., was it?
Not at all. The sources mention the first and second banks of the United States back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
But they didn't last.
No. Political opposition, debates about federal power. Then came the free banking era, which was pretty chaotic. Then national banks. But none really solved the core problem.
The recurring financial panics.
Exactly. The panic of 1907 was the straw that broke the camel's back, really highlighting the need for an elastic currency and a reliable lender of last resort.
So the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, was it a smooth process getting that passed?
Not really. There was the Aldrich Plan, based on European models, but critics feared it gave too much power to bankers.
Okay.
Progressive Democrats wanted more government control, maybe even full government ownership. Conservative Democrats wanted private control, but decentralized. Was a whole debate.
So the act was a compromise.
Very much so. The key compromise, it seems, was putting the main control in the hands of the government-appointed Board of Governors, but blending that with the regional quasi-private structure. It passed, but largely along party lines.
And since 1913, other laws have tweaked the Fed's role.
Oh, yeah. Glass-Steagall in the 30s separated commercial and investment banking. Dodd-Frank, after the 2008 crisis, brought major regulatory changes. The Fed's mandate and tools have definitely been shaped by legislation over time.
Now, how does the Fed actually keep tabs on the economy? The sources mention data collection.
They collect and publish a ton of data. The board's website, the FRB database from the St. Louis Fed, huge resources.
And the FOMC looks at all this when making decisions.
Absolutely. They look at inflation measures, employment data, growth indicators, financial market conditions, a whole dashboard.
What about measuring inflation specifically?
The preferred measure is the Personal Consumption Expenditures, or PCE price index.
Not the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, that we hear about more often.
They look at CPI too. But PCE is considered broader and reflects substitution effects better. Their long-run target is generally 1.5 to 2% PCE inflation. Diane Swonk, an economist mentioned, called inflation like a cancer on savings.
Strong analogy. And they track money supply, too. M1, M2.
Yes, though they stopped publishing the broadest measure, M3, some years back.
Yeah.
And of course, the unemployment rate is critical for that other side of their dual mandate.
Let's talk budget. You mentioned it's self-funded, not through Congress.
That's right. Mostly self-funded. Over 90% of its income comes from interest earned on the huge portfolio of Treasury securities it holds from open market operations.
So it makes money from managing the money supply.
Essentially, yes. And historically, it sent most of its net earnings back to the U.S. Treasury. Quite a bit, actually.
But that's changed recently.
It has. Because of quantitative tightening selling assets back and rising interest rates it pays on reserves, the Fed actually reported a net loss in 2023, about $114 billion.
A loss. How does that work? Can the Fed go broke?
Not really. They created something called a deferred asset on their books, basically an IOU to themselves that they'll pay back when they start making profits again. They expect this negative income situation might last until maybe mid-2027.
Does this stop them from doing monetary policy?
No. The sources emphasize it doesn't affect their ability to operate or conduct policy. It's an accounting situation, but a significant one. They still report budgets to Congress annually.
And the balance sheet itself, it must be huge.
Enormous. They publish it weekly. The source gives a snapshot from April 2021 showing assets like gold stock, securities held outright, and liabilities like Federal Reserve notes, currency in circulation, and deposits held by banks and the Treasury.
And the total size?
As of August 2024, total assets were over $7.1 trillion.
Wow. That's a lot.
It is. And that balance sheet also shows what backs the currency in your pocket.
Yeah.
Mostly those Treasury securities and other assets.
Okay, last big area, criticism. The Fed's powerful, it's bound to have critics.
Absolutely. And the criticisms come from various angles. Well, some argue its policies contribute to inflation or create asset bubbles, like keeping interest rates too low for too long.
Okay, that makes sense.
Others push for more transparency, feeling it operates too much in secret.
We mentioned the Bloomberg suit earlier.
Right. Then there's the historical criticism, like Friedman's point about the Great Depression, that the Fed made things worse.
And some argue it serves banks too much.
Yeah, that's a recurring theme, particularly from critics like Ron Paul. He argued the Fed benefits the financial elite.
Ron Paul wrote, "End the Fed," right?
He did. He and others in the Austrian economic school are critical of central banking itself, especially moving away from the gold standard. They advocate for free market money.
And the 2008 crisis response, bailouts.
That drew fire, too. Critics argued the bailouts created moral hazard, encouraging risky behavior, because institutions expect to be rescued. Ron Paul was very critical of that aspect as well.
So definitely no shortage of debate surrounding the Fed.
Not at all. It's constantly under scrutiny.
Well, this has been a really thorough deep dive based on the material provided. We've gone from its origins in panic prevention all the way to modern tools and controversies.
It's fascinating how it evolved, isn't it? That initial, quite specific goal versus the massive scope it has today.
Yeah, and for me, seeing that blend of public government control with those private elements in the regional banks, that was a real aha moment. Also, understanding the shift in how monetary policy tools are used now, post-2008.
And the sheer scale of it all. The balance sheet, the volume of currency. Plus, that recent negative income situation is definitely something unusual to track.
It really underscores how central the Fed is. You can't really understand the U.S. economy or economic news without having some grasp of what the Fed does and why.
Absolutely essential knowledge.
So to leave our listeners with something to chew on, what about that balance? The one between the Fed's need for operational independence to make tough, maybe unpopular policy decisions,
Yeah.
and its accountability to the government and the public it serves. It's a constant tension, isn't it?
It really is. So the thought to ponder is, how might that balance between independence and accountability need to shift or evolve in the coming years, given, new economic challenges, political pressures, technological changes, and what could different shifts mean for all of us and the economy?
Definitely food for thought. And of course, if you want to go even deeper, the Wikipedia article itself and its links are a great starting point. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.